probably with any idea that he could thus retrieve his fortunes, but feeling that in doing so he was occupying the last normal position of a properly fought constitutional battle. His enemies were resolved, more firmly than they were resolved before, to knock him altogether on the head at the general election which he had himself called into existence. He had been disgracefully outvoted in the House of Commons on various subjects. On the last occasion he had gone into his lobby with a minority of 37, upon a motion brought forward by Mr. Palliser, the late Liberal Chancellor of the Exchequer, respecting decimal coinage. No politician, not even Mr. Palliser himself, had expected that he would carry his bill in the present session. It was brought forward as a trial of strength, and for such a purpose decimal coinage was as good a subject as any other. It was Mr. Palliser's hobby, and he was gratified at having this further opportunity of ventilating it. When in power he had not succeeded in carrying his measure, awed and at last absolutely beaten by the infinite difficulty encountered in arranging its details. But his mind was still set upon it, and it was allowed by the whole party to be as good as anything else for the purpose then required. The Conservative government was beaten for the third or fourth time, and Mr. Daubeny dissolved the House. The whole world said that he might as well have resigned at once. It was already the end of July, and there must be an autumn session with the new members. It was known to be impossible that he should find himself supported by a majority after a fresh election. He had been treated with manifest forbearance. The cake had been left in his hands for 12 months. The House was barely 2 years old. He had no cry with which to meet the country. The dissolution was factious, dishonest, and unconstitutional. So said all the Liberals. And it was deduced also that the Conservatives were in their hearts as angry as were their opponents. What was to be gained but the poor interval of 3 months? There were clever men who suggested that Mr. Daubeny had a scheme in his head, some sharp trick of political conjuring, some hocus-pocus presto sleight of hand by which he might be able to retain power, let the elections go as they would. But if so, he certainly did not make his scheme known to his own party. He had no cry with which to meet the country, nor, indeed, had the leaders of the opposition. Retrenchment, army reform, navy excellence, Mr. Palliser's decimal coinage, and general good government gave to all the old Whig moderate Liberals plenty of matter for speeches to their future constituents. Those who were more advanced could promise the ballot, and suggest the disestablishment of the Church. But the government of the day was to be turned out on the score of general incompetence. They were to be made to go because they could not command majorities. But there ought to have been no dissolution, and Mr. Daubeny was regarded by his opponents, and indeed by very many of his followers also, with an enmity that was almost ferocious. A seat in Parliament, if it be for 5 or 6 years, is a blessing. But the blessing becomes very questionable if it have to be sought afresh every other session. One thing was manifest to thoughtful, working, eager political Liberals. They must have not only a majority in the next Parliament, but a majority of good men, of men good and true. There must be no more mismanagement, no more quarrelling, no more idleness. Was it to be borne that an unprincipled, so-called Conservative Prime Minister should go on slicing the cake after such a fashion as that lately adopted? Old bishops had even talked of resigning, and Knights of the Garter had seemed to die on purpose. So there was a great stir at the Liberal political clubs, and every good and true man was summoned to the battle. Now, no Liberal soldier, as a young soldier, had been known to be more good and true than Mr. Finn, the Irishman, who had held office 2 years ago to the satisfaction of all his friends, and who had retired from office because he had found himself compelled to support a measure which had since been carried by those very men from whom he had been obliged on this account to divide himself. It had always been felt by his old friends that he had been, if not ill-used, at least very unfortunate. He had been 12 months in advance of his party, and had consequently been driven out into the cold. So when the names of good men and true were mustered and weighed and discussed and scrutinized by some active members of the Liberal party in a certain very private room not far removed from our great seat of parliamentary warfare, and when the capabilities and expediencies and possibilities were tossed to and fro among these active members, it came to pass that the name of Mr. Finn was mentioned more than once. Mr. Phineas Finn was the gentleman's name, which statement may be necessary to explain the term of endearment which was occasionally used in speaking.